The point is, and this is the single most important point to keep in mind, and I'm sure that someone somewhere has tried to explain this to the president. We have no leverage. Whatever we've done has been a terrible mistake. We've destroyed relations with Russia. We should normalize relations with Russia. But to do that, we've got to end our, connection to this Ukrainian regime, stop funding and supporting the war. That has to happen. We have to admit that ultimately what happens in eastern Ukraine is a matter for Russian decision, not ours. It's never been an area of vital strategic interest to us, and it's not likely to become an area of vital strategic interest anytime soon. In fact, during World War II, as we got into the war and we were fighting and we approached the sort of end of middle to end of 1944, the truth was that we wanted to ensure that we overran Germany, not the Russians, not the Soviets at that point. Germany is what counted. Who controlled Poland was largely irrelevant to us. There was nothing in Poland except nice Polish people. But Germany was different. We ended up with a little more than half of what was there. And that was an unsatisfactory outcome, and that led to the Cold War. Well, the problem for us is that, we were too slow to pick up. Our forces moved too slowly. We lost the opportunity for a clear-cut victory. Well, this time around, the people with the real interest are the Russians, not us. We just don't have any interest in that part of the world. And I think President Trump knows that. He will probably say what any American would say: I hope these people can just get along. Well, that may or may not happen, but the point is, it's not our affair. He just needs to get out. And that much, I think, Vice President Vance gets right. But otherwise, if we continue to stick our nose into this, we'll make it worse. We need to get out of it. I think that President Trump has unrealistic expectations. He doesn't seem to understand that we can't mediate because we're part of it. Now, the second part is that I think President Putin has tried very hard to be polite, and to the extent that he can be flexible, to be flexible. But he's restated his preconditions for any sort of ceasefire from the beginning. And those preconditions require the acceptance of neutrality for Ukraine, the acceptance of the oblasts that the Russians took, that are Russian-speaking oblasts, that they're not going to surrender, and end to any further discussion about Crimea, which is Russian. And then, obviously, some discussion about denazification, which, we should have absolutely no objections to. And what sort of Ukraine emerges from that with elections and so forth and so on. Those things are all areas where there is some flexibility, except for the denazification. President Trump doesn't seem to have understood that. And so he seems to think that if he can't persuade President Putin to adopt his position, which is let's have a ceasefire and talk, then he's just going to pick up his toys and go away. I don't think President Trump understands that his toys are still in the game. And as long as they're in the game, his credibility is almost zero.
It's interesting because you pointed out there that the Russian position, Putin, when he came out, did say in his about 3-minute statement after the meeting, he said, "Yeah, sure, we'll agree to talk about these things. We'll talk about a ceasefire. We're more interested in the end of war negotiations, but we're open to that." And then he added, of course, it has to, address all the root causes, which is their code word for all the things you just mentioned about the territory and all that kind of stuff. So meaning that Putin didn't change anything that he didn't say in the many months prior to that. So it came out. And so Putin seemed relatively happy. Trump came out and said he was pretty happy about how things went out, especially on his Truth Social. But it really seems that the Russian media picked up on all the nuances, and they kind of have a good idea that it worked out really well for their side. Here's how the Russian media viewed it today.
Kommersant believes the call went very well for the Kremlin. It quotes President Putin as saying Russia agreed to work on a memorandum about a possible future peace agreement, defining a number of positions. Possible and future make it all sound rather vague. And that's the whole point. As the paper says, This way, Russia wins extra time and an unspecified time frame, while negotiations take place on agreeing the principles of a memorandum about something that's possible in the future and that defines a number of positions. And Russia will use this time as it sees fit. The paper quotes Putin as saying, "The conversation with Trump was very constructive. I rate it highly." The reporter adds, "Of course he does. The telephone call went his way." He notes that at the start of the call, Vladimir Putin congratulated the 47th US president on the birth of his 11th grandchild and wished Donald Trump's daughter good health. That was very smart. After that, you could say the conversation was destined to succeed. A political pundit tells Izvestia the results of the conversation with Trump, as described by Putin, show that Moscow continues to oppose a comprehensive ceasefire until a compromise can be found on those questions Russia considers key. First and foremost, we're talking about Ukraine making compromises and concessions. I think that last line says it all, really. Russia is ready for compromise and concessions, as long as it's Ukraine doing the compromising and making the concessions.
I mean, that certainly, that last part there seems completely in line with everything you've been saying since the war began, that Russia is not going to make concessions or compromises because they don't have to. They have the military power, the industrial, diplomatic, everything you want to mention there. And just, again, I have to ask, what don't the U.S. and Europe get?
The Europeans want a Ukraine that is not neutral. What its connection or relationship is with this increasingly irrelevant structure called NATO is open to question. But the notion is they want that somehow or another to be left open. I think the Europeans want to be able to put forces either into Ukraine or parts of Ukraine. Europeans want to have a say in the government that emerges in Kiev. And we could go on and on. None of that is going to happen. All of that is impossible. And the Europeans right now are hanging on by a thread. By the way, I think financially, we're not far behind in that sense. So I think President Putin knows that he can exercise more patience and things are going to go his way. Now, the one thing I thought was very interesting in this thing is that everyone was happy with the call in Russia. I think there are a lot of people in Russia who are very concerned, having fought this war for these many years and lost somewhere between 100 and 130,000 killed, that nothing be given away to the Ukrainians. And that's a very important thought to keep in mind. I mean, if you have a son or a brother or a father or your relative, you're extremely unenthusiastic about any sort of compromise that throws away what your respective relative died fighting for. So I think, excuse me, I think that President Putin understands that very well.
And in fact, Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, understands it very well, too. And so they are in no hurry to get anything done here. And I'm going to show you later in this episode why that is. But this is what he's saying today. He said that there are no, after the phone call, he said there's no deadlines and there cannot be any. It's clear that everyone wants to do this as quickly as possible. But of course, the devil's in the details. And I actually watched one of the video excerpts of him saying this statement right here. And he just has this kind of coy little smile on his face. He's like, this is just code for it ain't ever going to happen. But sure, we'll talk about it all day long and drag this thing out while we keep going forward on the battlefield. And then at some point, I think what's going to happen. But the Russians are specifically saying, despite whatever Trump's talking about, that I want to get this over with quickly, it's not going to be over with quickly.
No, well, everything that President Trump does is designed to be quick. It's designed to make a flash and signal to everybody that this is another Trump success story, another Trump victory. He's not going to get it out of this by any stretch of the imagination. Now, there was a mention of a memorandum. I don't know what the content of that would look like, but I suspect it might be useful to go back and look at the memorandum that was agreed to in April of 2022 between the Ukrainians and the Russians before Zelensky and his friends assassinated one of the leaders of the negotiating team from Ukraine and decided to throw it out. I suspect there'll be some similarity there. As you said, the Russians have been very consistent in what they want, very consistent in their demands. So none of this is new. Now, President Trump also has a habit of hearing what he wants to hear, and we shouldn't lose sight of that.